Yeah, just go. I'm gonna leave the cameras up. You know what you're doing.
All right, so
go for
we've
it.
got a hybrid game today. So we're using the board from the lovely collector's edition of Twilight Struggle.
That one.
And it is a really pretty board. It's, I mean, the other board, the board that comes with the deluxe edition, which is what I have, is super functional, but this is a lot prettier. So we're using that.
I have that one as well, obviously, because it's an amalgamation of the two.
We're using some of the minis from the collector's edition.
Yep.
But we decided to use the chits from the deluxe edition.
Right.
Because the thick wooden blocks that come with the collector's edition actually make it hard for Edward to see the stability numbers of each country. Right. So this is going to make more sense. And anybody who's familiar with the game, except for the very lucky few of you guys who have the collector's edition, will be able to understand what's going on here with the control markers. So, so let's start with a tour of the board.
Sure.
Right. So up here at the top, we have a turn track that goes from 1 to 10.
There you go. Yep.
Right, so the game will last a maximum of 10 rounds. So, and it's divided into three rounds in the early war, rounds 4 through 7, which are the mid war, and the late war from 8 to 10.
Yep.
So, you've also got a space race track. One of the mechanisms of the game enables you to move forward in the space race, which can give you points and powers. So that's tracking your progress there. And then down below, we've got some other tracks that sort of matter for the game. So we've got a DEFCON status track, maybe the most important track on the game, which shows how close we are to nuclear war. Which
this is bad.
Definitely a way the game can and often does end. It's bad. Whoever is the phasing player, the person who's taking their turn when that happens, loses. So you don't want that one to happen. Below that, we have required military operations. So each side is sort of expected to take a certain number of military operations per round, and so that'll track how many we've done. And essentially how that works is you have to look at the DEFCON status track at the end of the round, check your military against that, and if you have fewer military ops than the DEFCON number, you will lose points.
Okay.
So below that, we've got action round tracks. So we will take alternating action rounds. We will take 6 action rounds each starting in the early war, and in the middle and late war, we'll take 7 action rounds. There's also a condition in the game that can allow a player to take 8, which is why there's a number 8 on there, but it's mostly either 6 or 7 action rounds per turn, and we'll track that there. Finally, we've got a victory point tracker at the bottom. So another way the game can end is if the victory point tracker reaches plus 20 or minus 20 on either side. If the
depending on your point of view, right?
That's right. If the USSR reaches 20 or if the USA reaches 20, and the marker will start in the middle. So it's a tug of war over victory points throughout the game. So we've got some effect reminders over here. So lots of cards in the game might create a persistent effect, and we'll track that over here so we can remember and not forget that those effects are in play. And then finally, the meat of the board is a map of the world. And it is broken down into several subregions, which are shown by different colors and shadings, right? So within a region, right, so Asia is all orange, and Asia is special in that it also has a Southeast Asia, and you see those are sort of hashed light and dark orange. So within each subregion, you've got a collection of states. So states are countries roughly, although sometimes, as example here, Laos, Cambodia, there might be multiple countries represented by a single state on the board. Each country has sort of 2 indicators. There's a stability number, right? So for Afghanistan, that number is 2. For Australia, it is 4. And that tells us sort of how likely or unlikely as a country is to change control over the course of the game, through a bunch of different mechanics.
Higher number,
more stable. Exactly right. So, and then that number might be yellow, and it is for most of the countries on the board. But for many countries, you'll see their name is highlighted differently, and the number is in red. Those represent battleground countries. Those are sort of the most geopolitically important countries in the terms of the game. And they do lots of things differently, but the most important thing that's different about them is that when a player takes a coup action in those countries, it will lower the DEFCON level by a single number, which Doesn't sound like a lot, but you can only lower it by 4 before you hit nuclear war.
Right. Yeah.
So, so that's a tour of the board. And now, what do we do during the game?
Yeah, do tell. What do we do
so
during this game?
it's really each player takes turns playing cards and resolving the cards in one of several different ways. And so let's go through the sequence of play, which is helpfully printed on the board here.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Here, let me mosey it on over there. That should be close. Yeah, not really. That I didn't. I was unprepared.
Yeah, all good.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So at the start of every round, we don't need to do this in round 1, but at the start of every round, we'll increase the DEFCON status by 1. So if it were at 2 to start the round, which it often is, it would go up to 3. Then we will deal cards. And so players may have held cards from round to round.
Mm-hmm.
And so you will deal cards until each player is holding a number of cards equal to the action rounds for that turn plus 2.
Okay.
So in the early war, everybody will be holding 8 cards after the deal. In the middle and late war, everybody will be holding 9 cards after the deal. So then we will have what's called a headline phase. And so in the headline phase, each player will play one of their cards face down simultaneously, and then we'll reveal them and resolve the headline events. Next, we will set the required military operations. We'll go through the action rounds. So set just basically means return it to 0.
Okay.
And then we'll go through the action rounds. Okay, so on an action round, each player is going to look at their hand and play one card face up. So let's take a look at what a card looks like, go through card anatomy. All right, so these are the 4 kinds of cards you will see in the game. And the way you can tell what they are, so that the color and sort of information in a star will tell you the kind of card. So that's a US event. That's a Soviet event. That is a neutral event that can be played as an event by either country. And that one with no number inside the star is a scoring card. So those are the 4 kinds of cards. You also, for everything that's not a scoring card, have a little picture and some flavor text. The number inside the star will tell you the amount of operations points you can take if you play the card for its operations value. And then below the title of the card, there'll be information about the event that will happen if you decide to play the card for its event, or if you are forced to play the card for its event, which is often the case.
Right.
So when you play a card, if it is an event of your color, so if Edward plays a US event or if I play a Soviet event, I get to choose whether I want to play it for the event or for the operations points. If I play a neutral card, likewise, I can play it either as an event or for the operations points. If I play my opponent's event, so if I play a US card, or if Edward plays a Soviet card, we must trigger our opponent's event as part of playing the card. We can decide whether we want to do so before or after taking our operations points value for that event.
So to be clear, if I play my event card, so in other words, for instance, if I played the Marshall Plan, I either am doing that or that. So action points or that. If I play that, I'm doing both. And by I mean you're doing that and I'm doing that, but the order of what those happen is my decision. Since I'm the phasing player, I'm the one that played the card.
That's right. So if a player plays a scoring card, it's a little different because we will just do a little interim scoring in the middle of the game. And let's hold off on explaining how scoring works until we kind of finish with actions. So also note that at the bottom of some cards, so for example, the captured Nazi scientists, they will say remove from play if used as an event. So if you play that card for operations, it'll stay in play and just go into the discard pile, which means it'll be shuffled back in later. If it is played as an event, it will be removed from play permanently.
And to be clear, if you played this card, the event's triggering because I get the option I get the option. So which means the event is being played.
Yep.
So even if you played this,
that's
then
right.
That's
It's getting
away.
Triggered. That's right. And that's a bad enough event for me that once is plenty. So that's how the play goes. We will play in turns until we have played an equal number of action rounds. So it's 6 action rounds to start. And the way the game works, the Soviets will always go first, which means the US always gets last licks.
Cool.
So So if you don't choose to play for the event, or if you play your opponent's card, which means you get the operations points no matter what can you do with those?
What can you do with those?
There are 3 basic actions that you can take. When you choose one of those actions, you will spend all of your points on that action type. So the most basic and most common choice is to place influence markers.
You want to do this in the Middle East?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's look at the Middle East as it's set up at the beginning of the game. You can see that I've got some points in Syria and Iraq. Edward's got some points in Iran and Israel.
And by points, you mean influence, effectively,
That's
right?
You can tell that neither of us have got sufficient points for control because these markers are flipped over to their white side. If I wanted to control Syria, I have to have influence greater than my opponent in that state, equal to or exceeding the stability number of the country. So Edward currently has 0. If he had 1, I would need to add 2 influence to get control. As it is, I just need to add 1. So if I take my marker up from a 1 to a 2, I can get control of Syria. So that would cost me 1 operations point to add 1 point to Syria. I can also add operations point to any point currently connected to a country where I have influence. So I could add influence to Turkey, which is connected, as you can see, by this little red dotted line, which means it's going from one subregion to another.
So here to differentiate, the Middle East is the lighter color, and that purple is
Europe.
Is Europe.
That's right. So, and Europe actually has 2 colors as well, because Eastern Europe is light blue, and Western Europe is sort of dark purple blue.
Yep.
I could add influence in Lebanon. I could add influence in Israel. Just because Edward has influence there doesn't mean I can't add influence there. I cannot go to Iraq. Notice that even though these countries might be physically close to each other, they're not necessarily connected by these dark lines. And only if they're connected by a dark line could I add influence. So I'm sorry, I misspoke. I could add influence in Iraq because I already
because you had
there.
some, right?
But if it were like this, I could not.
Right.
Right. So another important point is that when an opponent controls a country, it makes it harder for you to influence. So if Edward had 2 influence here in Iran, if you can give me a number 2.
I'm on it.
Yeah. So I can add influence from Iraq, but it will cost me 2 influence points to add an influence in a country that's controlled. So that would cost 2 instead of the normal 1.
And if you did add that 1 in that case,
it would flip this over to the uncontrolled side.
Because I no longer have that number more than you.
That's right. Exactly right.
Yep.
Yep, that's the ticket.
And then at that point, it's just 1 influence point at that point, right?
It becomes 1 after. So if I wanted to spend, if it started out like this, and I, for some reason, wanted to spend 4 influence points in Iran, I could put 3 influence there, right?
2 for the first.
Yep.
And then 1, and then 1.
That's right.
There you go.
I would not have control at the end, but I would have more influence than Edward. Yeah.
Checks out.
So that's adding influence, which is, I think, the most straightforward. An important thing and an easy thing to forget is that you cannot daisy chain influence adding, right? So I cannot start out like this and then add to Turkey and then add to Greece. As much as I might want to do so, and certainly sometimes I would like to do that.
Right.
Right? And so that's something we have to kind of watch each other on.
So daisy chaining meaning starting new influence here and then going from the new influence into another country.
That's right. Exactly right. Yep. So that is placing influence. Fairly simple, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
So another kind of action you can take are realignment rolls.
Okay.
So realignment rolls allow you to essentially remove opponent influence in a given country. So, and just like with adding influence, if you choose to do realignment rules, that's all you can use your action points for.
Roger that.
So for a realignment rule, you're going to spend 1 operations point, and then you're going to evaluate the countries based on the control you see nearby. So let's take the example of North and South Korea.
Sure. Yeah. All right. I'll zoom in on this, and there you go. Good. That'll work.
Okay. So right now, I have control of North Korea. Edward has influence but not control in Japan and South Korea, and nobody has influence in Taiwan, right? If I wanted to try to remove Edward's influence in South Korea via realignment roll, I would declare that I'm realigning South Korea.
Okay.
And then we would look for 3 things. +1 for each controlled adjacent country that I have, it's +1 also if the country happens to be adjacent to the superpower.
Right.
So if it were like this instead, I'd get an extra point for him being next to the USSR.
Right. These dark
the control
lines
line
and
there.
Same, and also point out that Japan
is connected to the U.S., even though it's not obvious. The map actually spells it out pretty well.
It does. It does.
Also, I would gain points if I had more influence in South Korea than you had. And then you would also get those modifiers, right? So if you had Japan under control, you'd get a +1, and then we'd sort of measure out.
Right.
So the way this situation measures out is actually +0 for each of us. Because I have control of North Korea, but you have more influence in South Korea. Right?
So it's a +1 each, net 0.
That's right. So we would both roll one 6-sided die, and
of course they're going to hide on us. Okay,
in this case, right?
Yep.
You'd add the amount, which is 0 to it. My die is higher than yours by 3, which means I would take out as many as 2 influence. There's only 1 there, but it would go away. Yep. And so it's less common to use realignment rolls, but when the bonuses are in your favor, it can be a really handy way to get your opponents out of a region. So, and if that didn't work, I could try again. Let's say I used a 3 ops card on that, I would get 3 realignment rolls, and I'd have to do 3. So if it didn't work, I might as well try it again.
And if not there or somewhere else or whatnot.
Yep,
got it.
Yep, that's the ticket. So, and then the final action one can take is a coup. So coups are not like influence and realignments in that you can sort of use different spots with different action points. A coup is only going to be 1 card's worth of influence spent. So if I used, let's say, the China card, right, it has 4 influence points. And let's say I'm trying to coup in Iran.
Okay.
Right? So my value is 4, and it'll have to be only there. That's my action for the turn. And the way a coup works is that, so you can go anywhere an opponent has at least 1 influence. As I mentioned before, if the coup is in a battleground, as Iran is, it will drop the DEFCON status after the coup is resolved.
Right.
But
a lot of times we're just going to, so we don't forget.
Yep. Whether it works or not, DEFCON is still going down because that's thematically, that's a hot button spot in the world.
Destabilizing
Everybody
action.
in the world is freaked out by the fact that there was a coup there, right? And it brings us closer to the brink of war. So, and so the way we will do it is that we will compare my operations value to twice the stability value of the country. So that is 4 versus 4.
Yep.
And then only the phasing player will roll a die. So I'll roll 1 die. So in this case, I rolled a 3. So 4 versus 4 is 0. I would change influence in Iran by 3 in my favor. The first thing that would happen is any influence Edward had would come out.
So it would drop. It would step down.
1.
It would step down.
2, to 1 to 0. Right. So 1 would go away, and then I would get 2 influence in Iran.
There you go.
Right, which happens to be sufficient to control, which is kind of what I would be hoping for.
Right.
There you go. And then we drop the DEFCON status. So obviously it can be very difficult in some certain high status or high stability countries to coup.
Because double the number is 6.
Likewise, much easier in some low stability countries.
Yep.
But that's how coups work. Miss anything on coups?
I don't think so. The only thing, just to emphasize, the difference between battleground and non-battleground, you still double the number, it just doesn't lower the DEFCON. That's it.
Right.
That's the only difference.
That's right.
So, yeah.
So, I should point out that one of the things DEFCON status tracks is the ability for players to do coup or realignment rolls in certain regions. Once the DEFCON has dropped to 4, neither of us will be able to coup or realign in Europe. Once the DEFCON has dropped to 3, neither of us will be able to coup or realign in Asia. And once it's dropped to 2, neither of us will be able to coup or realign in the Middle East, which means that Africa, Central and South America are always on for coup and realignment attempts. Although, if you do it in the battleground, it will still drop the DEFCON level, which means you could accidentally create a nuclear war.
And whoever the phasing player is,
that's right.
When that goes, regardless of who caused it, whoever the active player is,
they lose. That's right. So,
I mean, we all lose. Really,
everyone
we all
loses, but
right?
in game terms, the phasing player loses.
Right.
So, okay, so those are the ways you can use your actions. Miss anything about that?
You'll get there, but the space race stuff. That's
right. That's right. So if you have a card with an opponent event that is so terrible that you can't imagine playing it, even though you get the operations value of the card. One thing you can consider doing with it is using it to advance your space race track.
All right. How do you do that, sir?
So you'll play the card. Let's say I decided to play the Marshall Plan as my space race card.
Yeah, because that's not great for you.
It's not great. I mean, I probably would just let this happen if I because it's a 4-ops card.
Right.
4-ops cards are nice. But yeah. So let's say that I decided I would use the Marshall Plan.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So so you would check the space race and look at what the next space says. This one says your card must be at least 2 operations value.
Checks out.
Okay, pass. Now and then it says you must roll, and it tells you what you have to roll. It's usually lower is better, and in the early going, this one says 1 to 3. So I would roll 1 die, and if I roll between a 1 and a 3, I did not. So I fail.
Right. So
But let's say I had passed.
Yes.
I would advance 1 on the track. Now this particular space says that there are some victory points associated. And so I would advance 2 victory points. If I were if Edward had beat me there, I would advance 1 victory point because I'd get the second value.
Yep.
And that's it. And then this goes not out of the game, but into the discard pile.
Right.
So just because I got rid of it once doesn't mean it's not coming back again. It is coming back.
Yeah.
So
and how many space races attempts, or how many times may you play into the space race?
Generally speaking, once per turn. But the space race does also offer powers to players, right? So if you reach a space before your opponent, you can use the power associated with the space until the opponent gets there. So the first power grant is that you can play 2 space race cards per turn. You can use that until I get there, right? And then later on, this means I have to show my headline card first before you have to choose what your headline is, which is pretty nice. This lets you discard a held card, which is just delicious.
Oh, no, I'm not playing that card for you. No, sir.
And this one lets you take 8 action rounds per round, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be really great, although the may is important there. Because sometimes you look at your cards and you're like, I want to take as few actions this turn as possible.
Right.
So
I think chat sums it up well. Cope with your political problems by firing them into space.
That's exactly right. That's right. You're sending your trash into space is really what you're doing.
Right, yeah.
That's not what you're thematically doing, but in game terms, it's definitely what you're doing. So, okay. One other thing about coups specifically, they will increase the required military operations track by the value of the operation you use. So if I'd used the Marshall Plan for a coup, my little red tank would go up to 4. Yeah. There are some other ways that can happen based on events on cards.
Usually military
war
things.
Cards. That's exactly right. So, and that's important because that can change the score by a little bit during scoring. So we will alternate rounds playing those kinds of cards. Sometimes we will have scoring cards in our hand. And so let's now go over what will happen there, because we'll get a kind of an interim scoring when we play a scoring card. So, so you've got the Middle East scoring card out.
Yep.
And right now, what would happen with Middle East scoring card is nothing.
Right.
Because what we do is when it's played, and note, by the way, that at the bottom it says it may not be held.
Yeah.
So the way the game is set up, you're dealt more cards than you need to play in a round.
Right.
You can always hold 1 card.
We're going to get dealt 8 cards. Mm-hmm. One's going to be a headline, and then we're going to take 6 rounds, so 7 of the cards. So meaning, from the baseline, we're each going to carry forward 1 card. At most, there may be things that change that for the first 3 rounds.
That's right. Okay. So, but you can hold any card except a scoring card. You have to play the scoring card in the turn that you get it. So.
Yep.
So, the way that scoring works is that we will evaluate the subregion, and we will check for presence, domination, and control, and then we'll also check battlegrounds.
Okay. All right. So walk us through it.
In order to
Looking at
have
the Middle East.
In order to have presence in a region, you have to control at least one country. So, if I had 2 influence in Syria, I would qualify for presence.
I, in this situation, do not, because I do not control anything.
That's
so
right.
that is 3 for you, 0 for me. Okay? All right. Domination.
So domination means that you need to have control of more countries overall and more battleground countries than your opponent. And you must control at least one of each. Right? So if I had control in Lebanon and Syria, and then I also had control in Iraq, I would have domination.
I would argue that works
Yep,
too.
that works too. Exactly
So,
right.
You have 2 total,
Yep.
which is more than I have.
Yes.
And you control more battlegrounds than I do, which is 1 versus
That's right.
my 0, and to a minimum of 1 each.
To a minimum of 1 each. You must have 1 battleground and 1 non-battleground to qualify.
You now have domination, so that would be 5 to 0, not 8 to 0. They're not cumulative.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Got it.
So control is simple. You just have to control every battleground in the region. So simple to explain, very hard to do. So you'll evaluate each side for presence, domination, and control. You'll only hit 1 marker, right?
Right.
So in this case, I qualify for domination. Edward qualifies for nothing, so I would score a net 5 points.
And if I had presence and you had domination, it would be net 2 to the Soviets.
That's exactly right.
There we go.
Then you'll also count control of battlegrounds, and each battleground will score you an additional point.
Yep.
So in this case, I would score 1 extra point because I control Iraq.
So 6-0 in the current setup. How
That's
that
right.
is. Okay.
That's the ticket.
Roger that. That's
All
scoring
right.
cards. And also, last thing on those, notice not removed from the game. They go into the discard.
That's right. And there's a sequence of play for them, right? So like Asia, Europe, and the Middle East are all going to get scored in the first 3 rounds. Then they will likely come back at least 1 more time, maybe twice. We will introduce the other scoring cards in the mid-war.
All right. So you want to explain how that works?
Yes.
Okay.
So after turn 3, we're going to change the deck a little bit.
Yep. So into the mid-war.
Into the mid-war. So we will add another big stack of cards, most of which are event cards, but some of which are scoring cards.
Yep.
And then after turn 7, we will add another smaller deck of cards.
The late war.
Yep.
If we make it that far.
Separately,
Yes.
whenever during dealing cards, this deck runs out,
Yes.
we will shuffle in all discarded cards. So not cards that are out of the game, but all discarded cards.
Yep.
So there's a couple of different ways reshuffles can happen.
Okay.
And, so that's how we'll see cards that have been played but are not out of the game. They'll come back again. That's how we'll see those scoring cards again.
Punted into space, but it returns.
Exactly right.
Yep.
So, all right. So then we will at the end after everybody's done the action rounds, we'll check military operations status. So if we didn't reach the appropriate amount, so let's say it was like this.
That's cute. Okay, sure. Let's say it was. I think it more realistically.
Yeah.
Here, this is probably something like this. 3 is bigger than 2.
That's right.
Checks out.
So I've done my job, which means I get nothing.
Right. Or you don't lose anything.
I don't lose anything. That's right.
2, 1 is lower.
So the
Score
victory
point
points. That's
for
right.
the Soviets.
Exactly right. So you have to at least reach DEFCON value with your military ops.
Yep.
So then it says flip the China card. So let's talk about the China card.
Oh, let's. Okay, here. Go ahead and throw it up there by the sequence of play.
Yep.
Like, turn it around
Like,
so people can read it.
Sure.
There you go.
People want to read it even. So the
Weird.
Soviets start with this card, the China card. It
Yep.
represents sort of Chinese influence during the Cold War. China is obviously a communist country throughout the Cold War, pretty much. So you'd sort of think they would always be on the side of the USSR, but the way it worked out really is that they tended to play both sides against the middle for their own gain. And so the way that's represented in the game is through this card. It's obviously a high operations value card that is neutral. it starts with the Soviets up and available for play. So I'll have it sort of in my display, and I can play it instead of one of my hand cards at any time during my turn. If I do so, once I've finished the action, and it is 4 ops power, plus if I use all of the operations value in Asia, it gets +1, so it's a 5.
It's a 5 in that one situation, but all of it has to be done in Asia.
That's right.
Yep.
So once I have completed it, I hand it to my opponent face down. He keeps it, and then at the end of the turn, he'll flip it over, and it'll be available for his use in the next turn.
And I keep it until...
You keep it until you're ready to hand it back to me.
Or there might be a game event that triggers.
There certainly are some events that trigger it. Yes, that's the trigger handing it back. So, and then whoever ends the game holding the China card will receive 1 extra point, which is also not bad.
Yeah, it's better than a sharp stick in the eye.
Yep, it is a political football. So we advance the turn marker. We do it all over again until one of the endgame conditions is met, which is DEFCON drops to 1. One of the 2 countries reaches plus 20, or we reach the end of round 10 or turn 10. At which point we do a final scoring. And final scoring is super simple. You score every region again, except not Southeast Asia. That only gets scored during the mid-war. So you score every region except Southeast Asia again, and then you give 1 point for the person who has the China card, and then we evaluate the score, and if the Soviets have at least +1, we win. If the U.S. has at least +1, they win.
All right, that was great.
That's how you play Twilight Struggle.
All right.
All right.
And thanks for watching, y'all. Hopefully it was fun or informative or helpful or maybe all of the above or some of the above. If so, consider watching one of those videos and subscribing to the channel. Certainly does help, and maybe even consider supporting us over on Patreon. All of those things really do help the channel. We appreciate it. Thanks, y'all.